Hello all, and welcome back to Uncharted X. My name is Ben, and this is part 2 of my investigation into the beautiful site of Machu Picchu. If you haven't seen part 1 of this video, I'd recommend checking that out before watching this, as I'm going to assume that you have seen it. This video will be a little different, it's a little less formal, but I wanted to take a look at some of the different areas of Machu Picchu and take a closer look at some of their features and their architecture. I also want to further explore some of the things that Hiram Bingham wrote in his book from 1913, and along with that I want to talk a little bit about my experience in visiting this site and to give you some recommendations for how you might structure your own visit to this iconic place. There are several distinct areas to Machu Picchu, and we'll take a look at each of these in turn, starting with the terracing system, or the system of retaining walls that surrounds the site. This is a common feature found across the Incan territory, but there are some unique aspects to this that we'll explore further. There is also the urban area, which surrounds the core of Machu Picchu. This is something that I think was mostly all built by the Inca, but it does encompass a very unique and beautiful megalithic portion known as the Sun Temple, as well as running water channels throughout this whole space. Behind Machu Picchu in all of the iconic photographs looms Huayna Picchu, which is the neighbouring mountainside. This very steep mountain also has a lot of building work done on it, and there's a really entertaining tale in Hiram Bingham's book about the attempts they made to climb this peak. And then, of course, there is the megalithic core of Machu Picchu. This area extends upwards and behind the walls that we've already seen in part 1 to the highest point on the site that includes the Intihuatana, or the hitching post of the sun, and we'll get into some of the details around that interesting little carving. The terracing system that was used by the Inca is very interesting. You find it all over the place on all of the steep mountainsides across the Sacred Valley, and some of these terraces are still in good use, and that's for good reason. The Inca were an expert agricultural society, and they needed this terracing system in order to grow to the size or the population base that they did, which was millions of people. This terracing allowed them to farm what would otherwise have been untenable farming land. And they did this up and down the mountainsides all throughout the Sacred Valley with a purpose. And their system is explained here by Rogelio.
So in Machu Picchu we're going to find 3 important sectors. Where we are now, it was the agriculture sectors. Still there is a lot of controversies about where the Incas grow in this place. So probably all these terraces only was as a big garden just to grow the most important plant in that time. What is the most important plant?
Coca.
Coca plant. Why? Because between the Andes and the real jungle, so we are in the center part, is where the coca plant grows really well. Really tiny, but has the powerful. Yeah? All the leaves, all the mountain people prefer the tiny leaves. Why? Because the tiny leaves has more power things. Of course, more below you can find coca plant, but it's quite tall and has big leaves, but has not the same quality, the same power, amigos. Yeah? That's why probably one of the theories said that this area was only as a big place, as a greenhouse only for coca plant. Yeah? So just 2 hours walking or following the Inca Trail, there is huge farming places. 3 Inca sites there that they have like a 35 between 60 terraces like this. So mostly this place it was to grow crops, because just 2 hours walking the Incas can find so the different type of crops. We're talking about Huayna, Intipata and Cantupata, which is just behind this mountain. Yeah? Roughly take 2 hours. So the people, maybe in your next time you will make Inca Trail, so you will prove that. Yeah? There is terraces located in 3 different levels. One is over 2,100 meters, a lot of farming place. You can see from the train when you came here before you get Aguascalientes. That's one farming place. The other one is over 2,700 meters, the same level than Sacred Valley of the Incas. And the other one has 3,600 meters. already 3 Inca sites in the same part, but in this different levels. So in the Incas, they can have in the same times or all the year around different type of crops. We're talking about down below, close to the river, tropical fruits, different type, also yucca potatoes, sweet potatoes things. Over 2,700 meters, where is another Inca site, and a lot of terraces, they can grow the same thing that grow in the Sacred Valley. What does mean that? A lot of type of corn, yeah? Over 3,600 meters, which is another Inca site, so they can grow only different type of potatoes. So they can have in the same time 3 different type of crops, and just to support people here, yeah? So that is the point here.
I think that 99% of the terracing that you find throughout the Sacred Valley is the Ucunpacha or the Incan style architecture. You see it up and down all of the mountainsides as you drive around. It's complete with stone staircases, and it's just an incredible amount of work that's clearly gone into creating garden beds and flat patches to farm land on. You do also find it very often around the actual megalithic sites, and in some areas you'll also see that it's incorporated into sections of megalithic retaining walls, and here and there you can see where I think some of this megalithic work has been repaired. At Machu Picchu, I think you see a mix of what I would say megalithic and Inca work when it comes to the retaining walls and terraces. And that is because I think, and this is just my impression of it, that it was originally a megalithic site that was destroyed and then later rebuilt and then expanded on by the Inca. Some of these retaining walls that you see around the place are just absolutely huge. And because they lack the real precise nature of the megalithic walls and the core of the site, it certainly is possible that the Inca did this work. But it's not a common approach for them to use very large stones in their retaining walls and terracing systems, although they were known, and we have some recorded accounts of them trying to move very large stones. My guess on these imprecise but massive retaining walls, and it, I guess is really all that it is that I think these are older and that they're part of the original landscaping and retaining walls used at the site. Take a look at this area. These retaining walls, even though there's nothing that seems to be on top, these are just absolutely huge relative to the rest of the work around the site. It's not very precise, but it does seem to match the granite material that's used in the core of the site, this white granite. It's also next to some very interesting walls that quite clearly show how the Inca built their walls on top of the older megalithic style. Here's a few more examples of this at Machu Picchu. As I said, the Inca were actually observed trying to move around or moving around some very large stones. And this happened in particular at Sacsayhuaman by some of the 16th century Spanish chroniclers that were observing the Inca actually doing some work on the site. I think that what they were observing was repair and restoration work, but there are some interesting quotes that get used typically as proof that the Inca were responsible for building all of these sites. So it's a worthy sidebar to explore this to see, well, could this be interpreted as, repair and restoration work? Translating from the original Spanish in the books that come directly from a couple of the 16th century chroniclers, a couple of quotes here. Juan de Betanzos said that, quote, Topa, this guy, ordered the entire crowd to pull the ropes with which it was tied, end quote. He's describing how they were trying to move the stones. Garcilaso de la Vega, a guy that I've mentioned before, also expands on this observation. He writes, quote, they did not have any ingenuity to climb and descend the stones. They did everything by force of arms, end quote. De la Vega also describes the method in which stonemasons were shaping stones, and he says here, quote, the stonemasons had no other instruments to carve the stones than some black pebbles they called Huayna, with which they carved them by crushing rather than cutting, end quote. I think we can agree that this is describing fairly primitive efforts, but what I think they're describing here is repair and restoration work rather than actual construction work going on at Sacsayhuaman. Certainly the method of stone shaping by banging on them with other rocks can really not explain that incredible precision that we see in a lot of the tight-fitting megalithic walls. But it certainly does explain how the Ucanpacha work or the Incan-style work might well have been done. De la Vega noted in his observation here that he didn't see them using levers or wheels or rolling around the big rocks on stone balls or with logs, that they did everything by main force. So the Inca would just apply people and force to the problem rather than any forms of even basic technology. They'd just take a bunch of ropes that were made out of llama hair and leather, they'd wrap those around a big rock, and then they'd get a few thousand of their high-altitude athletic buddies to pull on the ropes, and you can eventually move or stand up some big stones and, I think, put them back into position, which is exactly what I think we're hearing about with these quotes. Now, I'm not saying that they rebuilt all of the megalithic work. I do think that some parts of the original megalithic installations survived whatever cataclysmic destruction that they obviously went through in the distant past. But it certainly does seem likely that the Inca picked up a lot of this megalithic work and did their best to restore parts of these sites. And I think that these descriptions really fit that sort of activity. Another Spaniard from the 16th century, Gutierrez de Santa Clara, he described how they would stack larger stones together by building earthen ramps and then hauling the stone up to the height that they needed it to be by main force once again. Very primitive methods. They would put that stone in place and then they would remove the earthen ramp. So again, no leverage, no wheels, no technology at all. I'm not sure how you can really take these examples and use them as proof that the Inca built all of these sites, because there is another less often reported tale that comes from these same 16th century chroniclers that also describes the nearest quarry for Sacsayhuaman as being 25 kilometers away, and the furthest quarry for that site was around 75 kilometers away. This is all over some incredibly difficult terrain. Take a minute to consider how difficult this task really is. I think you have to have quite an imagination to truly believe that this primitive method, as described by these chroniclers, of thousands of people simply yanking on a rope with no leverage, no rolling stones or logs, is enough to move a 10 or a 20, 30 or even 50-ton stone more than 25, maybe even 75 kilometers through the Andes mountain range and get it done. You are talking about terrain that's over 10,000 feet in height and some extremely steep slopes. Something else to keep in mind is that the Inca civilization were only here for a short time, a little less than 150 years, and it was this period that they were supposed to have built all of these sites, all of the megalithic work and all of the terracing. So even if you insist that enough effort and enough people using these primitive methods will get the job done, and by the way, this is the same national project or beer and blankets approach used to explain the Great Pyramid by guys like Zahi Hawass in Egypt, I think that you're still up against some serious time challenges for the amount of work that we're looking at. Whether or not everyone agrees that these primitive methods were responsible for all of the megalithic work in Peru, I think we all can agree that doing the work this way, dragging huge stones with ropes and shaping them by chipping on them with pounding stones, would take an awful long time and require an awful lot of people. There is one more significant piece of evidence that I think suggests that the Inca were not responsible for the original megalithic work, and this piece of evidence is located in Cusco. I've used this clip before, but it's worth showing here again because I think it's quite compelling, particularly so if again you keep in mind that we're only talking about a period of around 150 years, which is really not enough time to go through the massive up and down in architectural technology that is suggested by all the different building styles we see in Peru. Here's Brian Forrester.
Really good evidence that Cusco existed before was the fact that the Inca 1,000 years ago were kicked out of Lake Titicaca by the Aymara people. And so rather than dispersing, they knew that they would find a place to resettle. And they followed a road that existed north. And when they got to within 1 hour's drive of Cusco, there is a big wall with a gate in it. That's called the Intihuatana, and that is megalithic. As they followed the gate, they encountered megalithic structures. By the time they reached Cusco itself, they found an abandoned city that was megalithic. And so blown away by this fact that I'm sure they said, maybe, this was the city of the gods. This is where we're going to build our new capital. And so the Coricancha existed at that time, and because of its energetic nature, and profound construction, I believe that Manco Capac simply said, this is too profound for me to live in. I get first choice of all of the other megalithic structures. And so he looked up on the hill, which is exactly where we are, and he found what is called San Cristobal, and he said, rebuild this megalithic ruin and make it my palace. And a policy of the Inca was that each of the 12 Inca in succession had what was called a panaca, and that means they chose who did what, like who was in charge of the military, who was in charge of the priesthood, etc., and it had to be a member of the family. But when that High Inca died, the son who inherited the title of High Inca got to choose his own government and people, which is a very smart move. So what you had was the son of Manco Capac could not live where we are in Manco Capac's palace, so he had to find another place to live. And so he would have one of the other megalithic courtyards rebuilt. By the time you get to the 8th High Inca, there were no more megalithic ruins to be restored. So that's where we find that the 9th, the 10th, the 11th all had to build their structures from scratch. And what we see there is they're all made of little blocks or adobe. No megalithic work. So if the Inca were responsible for the megalithic work, it meant they had profound capability in the beginning and slid downhill for the next 500 years, which is not the case. They simply found an abandoned megalithic city and rebuilt it.
The urban area at Machu Picchu is characterized by what must be a couple of dozen of these quite well-made dwelling structures. Here, Hiram Bingham describes the common form that these dwellings take, along with a couple of their notable features. Quote, one of the most striking characteristics of Machu Picchu architecture is that a large majority of the houses are of a story and a half in height, with gable ends. These gables are marked by cylindrical projecting stones, carrying out the idea of the wooden rafters, which have disappeared. In the case of these two adjoining houses, the southern gables alone are standing, the northern gables having been knocked off either by earthquakes or owing to the destructive forest vegetation. End quote. In general, my impression of these houses is that this is some quite well-made Ucan or Incan-style work. I think that all of this type of area was rebuilt and remade by the Inca, in many cases built on top of megalithic foundations. And in fact, when you talk about the cylindrical projecting blocks and the shapes of the windows, What we see here is an imitation of the style that's carried out to a far finer degree of precision and accuracy in their core megalithic work. The cylindrical blocks themselves are fairly interesting. They were most likely for attaching to rafters that then you would lay your roof structure on. As shown here in this picture, you can see that the cylindrical blocks have been used to tie the rafters to the house. What's interesting is that you can also find these cylindrical blocks just left lying around. Perhaps this is a consequence of the destruction that happened to this site in modern times. And in some cases, you can also find these blocks simply used as filler in some of the rough stone walls. So either there was an overproduction of these things, or they were just left lying around from megalithic times. I'm not really sure what to make of them. This shape is also a feature of some of the megalithic work in the core. You can see the same type of protruding cylindrical shape, or in some cases a square shape, forming part of the megalithic core walls. I do want to acknowledge that there is an alternative argument to be made here. Because we have the same shapes reflected in the Incan style architecture and in the megalithic architecture, the cylindrical blocks, the shapes of the windows, that could be used as an argument to suggest that the same people or the same culture built all of this same architecture. Now obviously, if you've watched any of my videos about South America or even Egypt, you'll know that I don't think this is the case. I think that we're looking at the work of two separate and very distinct cultures, at least two, and much longer timelines. But it's worth reinforcing that ultimately I think the only answer somebody can come to today is really, I don't know. There just isn't enough evidence to conclusively prove this one way or the other. My opinions on this are really based on the available data. Things like the Incan origin stories, what they said themselves about their own history. Some of the evidence coming from adjacent fields of science, the Younger Dryas, the extension of the human timeline. And it's based on an analysis of the level of technology that is involved in actually creating these various styles of architecture. Still, when it comes to South America, this is all really circumstantial evidence. There isn't enough here to conclusively prove this one way or the other, and I try to remain open to new ideas and to new theories on this. These urban spaces also contain a couple of just beautiful megalithic structures. The one that is probably best known is the Sun Temple, which features this curved wall. This type of a curved, rounded shape to the wall is quite rare in Peru, although not unheard of. There are other examples of this type of thing, the Coricancha comes to mind, but typically that curved shape is associated with the sun, so today we call these sun temples, although we really have no way of knowing whether or not that had anything to do with their original purpose or function. This building in particular does cast an auspicious shadow on the dates of the solstice, as we'll find in many of the other megalithic remains around Peru. What I find interesting about the Sun Temple is that when you look at this structure from above and behind, which is not a common angle that people take on it, you can see that it seems to be wrapping protectively around a huge carved piece of bedrock, which is a pretty prime example of Huayna Picchu architecture. This is also an excellent example of the circular protection or the general respect and reverence that the builders seem to have had for this older form of megalithic work. One thing's for certain, having this giant piece of carved stone in the middle of the building reduces its functionality for use as a building. You can also see that on top of the Sun Temple there's been some effort at restoration. The work clearly becomes more inferior in the top couple of layers of masonry. Beneath this structure is one of the more remarkable pieces of megalithic work that you can find anywhere in Machu Picchu. It features a quite astonishing collection of just curved and flowing blocks that seem to form in with the native rock that's here. There's no access allowed into this specific area today, they've got it roped off, but if you dig back through some archival photographs, we can find some indications of what the work in here looks like. Note the protruding cylindrical shape, the same thing we see in the urban area. I'm not sure you can attribute this to any form of rafter system, given it's in a cave. And there is also something in here that I can only describe as looking like the Intihuatana stone, or a hitching post stone, although I'm not quite sure if that makes sense given this isn't really open to the sky. Another notable megalithic construction in the urban area is what Hiram Bingham called the best made wall in all of Machu Picchu. I think its location, being right in the middle of the urban area, is a great example of the contrast and the quite clearly different levels of technology involved in the different building styles. Again, my impression of this whole urban area is that it's been constructed on top of what well may have been an earlier megalithic construction. Throughout this area, and as well as throughout other parts of Machu Picchu, you can find water channels that have been carved into the stone. In some cases, these water channels are still running, and most of the quality of the stonework here is quite high. As you go around and look inside many of these houses, you'll find other blocks that have pretty clearly been carved to be part of this watering system. These channels are quite narrow, and interestingly, Hiram Bingham really thought that there wasn't enough water here to support a large population, which is perhaps one reason why the site was abandoned by the Inca well before the Spanish arrived on the continent. He traced the origin of this water back to some springs that is perhaps a mile away along the mountainside, but he didn't think there was enough water here to support a large population. There also seems to be a system of underground channels that are used to move water, because you'll find these channels emerging out of like the side of blocks that are underground at higher levels, and some of them are still running with water. In a few places you can find these indications of what must be a deeper layer of architecture at Machu Picchu. Several of the structures in this urban area also have stone basins, and again you can find many of these carved channeled blocks lying almost randomly around the place, perhaps as a result of some form of destruction on the site. Stepping back to the macro view of Machu Picchu, one of the dominating features of all of the iconic imagery of this site is Huayna Picchu, which is the very steep mountain that sort of sits in the background and looms over the city itself. It's also had a lot of work done to it. There is a path that has been carved into the mountainside to get up there, as well as several terraced areas and even a couple of the similar type of gabled end dwelling structures up there. As you can see, there are people all over this. It is a special ticket if you go to Machu Picchu and you want to climb Huayna Picchu. It's not for the faint of heart. It's very steep, it's a fairly rigorous climb, and it does require a special ticket to be able to get up there. It takes probably half the day to get up and then come back down from Huayna Picchu. As you could imagine, in Hiram Bingham's time, this mountain was completely overgrown. There was no indication of a path or of any of the work that we can see up there today, as most of Huayna Picchu has actually been cleared in our modern times. There's an amazing account of assistant topographer Heald, who was one of the members of Hiram Bingham's team, as he attempted over several days to get to the peak of Huayna Picchu and investigate it. He had a really close scrape with death, and I want to tell that story from Hiram Bingham's book. As I read this, the footage that you'll see in the background is of another area that you can go to. So if you don't want to climb Huayna Picchu, but you kind of want a taste of some of those steep edges and drop-offs and a little bit of hiking away from Machu Picchu, you can get to an area known as the Inca Bridge. This is over the back, if you like, away the opposite direction from Huayna Picchu. There's a trail that takes a few minutes to get to, and it culminates with this just incredible part of an Inca trail that's carved into what is just an absolutely sheer precipice in this giant granite wall on a mountainside. You'll see this trail marked by the green vegetation line along the sheer wall of the cliff, and it's quite amazing to imagine people going back and forth on this trail. The last part of this trail that is available to tourists before you get to what is a locked wooden gate preventing people from going out onto the Inca Bridge itself also has a very steep drop-off to the right, and it does take a little bit of screwing up of your courage to go out there, particularly if you have any fear of heights. Reading now from assistant topographer Heald's account of his climb of Huayna Picchu, as reported in Hiram Bingham's book. Quote, Huayna Picchu, lying to the north of Machu Picchu and connected with it by a narrow neck, rises some 2,500 feet above the Urubamba River, which runs around its base. On one side, the south, this elevation is reached by what is practically one complete precipice. On the other, while there are sheer ascents, there are also slopes, and, according to the account of one Artiega, who claims to have explored the forests which cover a good deal of it, was once cultivated, the slopes being converted into level fields by low earth terraces. My first trip to reach the summit of Huayna Picchu and to ascertain what ruins, if any, were on it, ended in failure. The only man who had been up, Artiega, who lives at Mandor Pampa, was drunk and refused to go with me, so I decided to try and find a way without his help. I knew where his bridge crossed the Urubamba River and where he had started up when he went the year before. With these two things to help me, I thought that I could very likely find as much as he had. Accordingly, I started with 4 peons and Tomas Cambinas, the soldier, to have a look. The river was passed easily on the rather shaky 4-pole bridge, and we started up the slope, cutting steps as we went, for it was almost vertical. About 30 feet up it moderated, however, and after that, while it was steep, we seldom had to cut steps for more than 20 to 30 feet on a stretch. The greatest hindrance was the cane and long grass, through which it was hard to cut away with the machetes. Our progress, slow at first, got absolutely snail-like as the men got tired. So, getting impatient, I resolved to push on alone, telling them to follow the marks of my machete, and charging Tomas to see that they made a good trail and did not loaf. I pushed on up the hill, clearing my way with the machete, or down on all fours, following a bear trail, of which there were many, stopping occasionally to open my shirt at the throat and cool off, as it was terribly hot. The brush through which I made my way was in great part mesquite, terribly tough and with heavy, strong thorns. If a branch was not cut through at one blow, it was pretty sure to come whipping back and drive half a dozen spikes into hands, arms, and body. Luckily, I had enough practice to learn how to strike with a heavy shoulder blow, and for the most part made clean strokes, but I didn't get away untouched by any means. Finally, about 3 p.m, I had almost gained the top of the lowest part of the ridge, which runs along like the backplates of some spined dinosaur. The trees had given way to grass or bare rock, the face of the rock being practically vertical. A cliff some 200 feet high stood in my way. By going out to the end of the ridge, I thought I could look almost straight down to the river, which looked more like a trout brook than a river at that distance, though its roar in the rapids came up distinctly. I was just climbing out on top of the lowest backplate when the grass and soil under my feet let go and I dropped. For about 20 feet there was a slope of about 70 degrees, and then a jump of some 200 feet, after which it would be bump and repeat down to the river. As I shot down the sloping surface, I reached out and with my right hand grasped a mesquite branch that was growing in a crack about 5 feet above the jump-off. I was going so fast that it jerked my arm up, and as my body was turning, pulled me from my side to my face. Also, the jerk broke the ligaments holding the outer ends of the clavicle and scapula together. The strength left the arm with the tearing loose of the ligaments, but I had checked enough to give me a chance to get hold of a branch with my left hand. After hanging for a moment or two, so as to look everything over, and to be sure that I did nothing wrong, I started to work back up. The hardest part was to get my feet on the trunk of the little tree to which I was holding on. The fact that I was wearing moccasins instead of boots helped a great deal here, as they would take hold of the rock. It was distressingly slow work, but after about half an hour I had gotten back to comparatively safe footing. As my right arm was almost useless, I at once made my way down, getting back to camp about 5:30, taking the workmen with me as I went. On this trip I saw no sign of Inca work, except one small ruined wall." End quote. About a week later, Mr. Heald did actually go back up, and he did conquer the top of Huayna Picchu, this time with the help of his drunken mate Artahagia. And although there doesn't seem to be any real megalithic work up here, the fact that the Inca came up here and still used this area to do as much farming as they could, perhaps as a signal station or a small outpost for somebody to look out or something like that, it's just remarkable. These people were truly mountain goats, I think. And this tale from Hiram Bingham's book really reads like it should be something in the Cliffhanger movie or out of an Indiana Jones movie. I think he would be much more deserving of that title than our modern-day pampered archaeologists like Mr. Hawass. Let's now turn to some of the features of the megalithic core of Machu Picchu, which is personally my favourite place on all of the site. These walls and structures are the products of some true masters of stonework, and I also think there is some evidence for restoration and rebuilding work by the Inca here. On one of these main walls, you can see that there's been some sinkage in the ground that has caused the whole structure to tilt over, although it hasn't toppled over entirely, which I think is testament to the earthquake-proof nature of a lot of this megalithic construction. One of the more interesting aspects of this area is what's known as the Temple of the Three Windows. Hiram Bingham thought that these three windows were quite significant, and that it might have had a connection to the legend of the Inca origins. That was the story that I read out in part 1 of this series. This detailed three brothers leading the tribes to Cusco at the rise of the Inca as a civilization, and as the story goes, they led those tribes by exiting through three windows or three caves, and he thought that this could be that place, that mythical origin place of the Inca themselves. He detailed this connection extensively in his book, and he planned to try and settle the debate as to whether or not this was in fact this mythical origin location for the Inca. I think he was most likely incorrect on this. I don't think this was the origin point for the Incas. Machu Picchu is north of Cusco, and most evidence today suggests that the Inca originated from the southwest of Cusco, in the direction of Lake Titicaca and Tiwanaku, which is in modern-day Bolivia. Quoting Hiram Bingham from his book, quote, "The fact that one of the most important buildings was marked by three large windows, a rare feature in Peruvian architecture, and that many of the other buildings had windows, added to the significant circumstance that the city was located in the most inaccessible part of the Andes, inclined me to feel that there was a chance that Machu Picchu might prove to be Tampu Tocco, that mythical place from which the Incas had come when they started out to found Cusco and to make the beginnings of that great empire which was to embrace a large part of South America." End quote. That's quite a single sentence there, Mr. Bingham. One of the reasons that I'm not sure about this connection is that in this wall there appears to be more than three windows. On one side of it you can see that there are more than three of these actual window frames, if you like, but we still have stones inside the frames. It may well be the case that there were originally stones in these open windows, much like there are in the windows on either side of it that are blocked up. It's possible that the Inca removed them at some point. In fact, Hiram Bingham actually notes this same feature, that there are some windows that appear to be blocked up, and you can see this quite clearly from the backside of the wall. He makes note of this on the caption to this photograph, quote, "An exterior view of part of the Temple of the Three Windows, showing the location of a former window which was filled up at some time in the past when it was considered suitable to reduce the number of windows in this remarkable structure from 5 to 3. Tradition says that the Inca's ancestors came out of 3 caves or windows." End quote. Walking away from this central megalithic area, you ascend some staircases to get to what is the highest point at all of Machu Picchu itself. And here we find one of the most interesting pieces of stonework on all of the site, the hitching post of the sun, or the Intihuatana stone. Quoting Hiram Bingham again, quote, "The place to which the sun is tied. On top of the beautifully terraced hill behind this temple is a stone, generally agreed to be an Intihuatana stone, or sundial, the Intihuatana being the, quote, place to which the sun is tied," end quote. Similar stones were found by the Spanish conquerors in Cusco, Pisac, and Ollantaytambo, end quote. Now, some people seem to think that this is a sundial. Other people seem to think that it's a marker for the solstices. However, I think the best explanation for what this is as a marker for the equinoxes. While the 4 faces of this stone do mark the cardinal directions of north, south, east, and west, what's quite remarkable is that on the equinoxes, when the sun is over the top of this stone, it casts no shadow at all. And this is only possible because the top of the stone, the top part of it, is angled very slightly. It has a 13.5 degree tilt to it. This matches the latitude of Machu Picchu, which is located at around 13.5 degrees south on the globe. This is a very interesting connection to me because it marks the celestial event of the equinoxes, twice a year when the day and the night, or the length of the day and the night, is equal. On those days, and because the tilt of this rock matches the latitude of the location of Machu Picchu, this stone casts no shadow, and I'm fairly convinced that this isn't accidental. It seems to me that this is somewhat of a contradiction to the mainstream story of the origins for Machu Picchu, which states that this whole place was built as a refuge for Pachacuti and then abandoned within around 80 years. So was this place just a refuge for their royalty, or was it perhaps something more significant, a solar observatory used for longer periods of time? It seems possible that this stone is part of a much larger carving. If you look at the edges of the platform that the Intihuatana stone sits on, it seems to be all part of one just huge piece of Hanan Pacha architecture. In order to mark the equinoxes and to get the degree of this stone exactly right, you either need to know exactly where Machu Picchu is on the globe and you have to know the latitude so you can get that tilt right, or you have to know exactly what the date of the equinox is so that you can carve your stone or at least mark out where it should be when the sun's overhead. It's something of a chicken and egg problem. You have to have a fairly sophisticated understanding of the movement of the heavens and how those movements of the heavens work relative to where you are on the ground. As Bingham said, there are other examples of Intihuatana stones, and one is still standing at Pisac. All of the others were destroyed by the Spanish, naturally because they thought it was some form of occult pagan worship and went against their faith, so should therefore be eradicated. Although the Intihuatana stone at Machu Picchu used to be open for tourists to touch and to look at closely, today it's roped off. You can't really get that close to it. This stone was damaged in the year 2000 by, of all things, the filming of a beer commercial, and apparently, according to the story, a 1,000-pound crane actually fell on the Intihuatana stone and it chipped off a section of one of its edges, which led to some significant protests by the local people. I think very well-founded protests. This is definitely not the type of thing we should be doing to these types of sites. I think we should be preserving and protecting them and making them available for research in the future. The last thing I wanted to cover here was just some tips and advice on how you might structure a day should you want to visit Machu Picchu. I've been to this site a couple of times myself, and it can be something of a tourist trap if you aren't prepared or you haven't done enough planning, just given the number of people that come here. Ever since they had the revolution in Egypt, it seemed like Machu Picchu replaced the pyramids for a lot of people, and for the last couple of decades it feels like this place has been sort of crammed to the rafters with tourists. It is Peru's #1 tourist destination. So if ever you're planning a trip to Peru and you want to visit this site, my advice would be to structure the whole trip around the dates that you can get your tickets to Machu Picchu. So within whatever window you want to travel, the first thing you should do is look for your tickets to Machu Picchu. You also at that point want to choose the train time. So the main thing that works around this is the tickets that you can get on the train that takes you up to Aguas Calientes from Alante Tambo. It's a beautiful train journey, takes a couple of hours, goes down through the jungle, then ascends up to the mountains. But my advice would be to get the earliest train ticket you can. It's a very early start in some cases, but if you can catch that first train or a couple of the earliest trains, that's the best way to see Machu Picchu. Get there early, get up to the site early, take the earliest bus you can, get into the site and get away from the entrance, and you're going to have a few hours at least where you're avoiding most of the hordes, because by 11 o'clock towards lunchtime, the site will be at maximum capacity for the rest of the day. And if you can stay ahead of where people are, you're going to have a better experience. Unfortunately, I believe these days it is pretty much of a one-way journey through Machu Picchu. The times that I've been there previously, you were pretty much free to roam all over the site, but they're fairly strict now about trying to keep the flow of people going in one direction, which is a little unfortunate. But there are some areas where you can kind of escape the overview of the hawkish inspectors, and I'd encourage you to do that wherever you can. Push the boundaries a little bit. Obviously treat the site with respect, but don't be afraid of them tweeting a whistle at you. They do it all day long. Definitely take some food and some water with you in a backpack when you go. There is a concession stand or some food sales up at Machu Picchu itself, although typically, being the captive audience that it is, it's quite expensive. Toilet paper is not a bad idea either. You generally have to pay for that sort of thing as you go at Machu Picchu, and there are restrooms available up there as well. And then the last recommendation that I have is that if you're in any way in decent physical shape, I'd recommend walking back down from Machu Picchu to Aguas Calientes. You probably want to take the bus on the way up. It's a fairly strenuous hike up, but you can take the Inca Trail down and walk back to Aguas Calientes. I think from memory it takes a couple of hours. It's a steep trail down, there's a lot of steps down, but it's quite a lovely journey through the jungle and looking at all of the surrounding landscape, and then you get back to Aguas Calientes. I also wouldn't be afraid of booking a later train ticket home. Aguas Calientes is a nice little tourist town. There are quite a number of bars and restaurants and just cool little areas to hang out. There's a lot of shops where you can buy stuff. And after a day at Machu Picchu, it's nice to hang out there and have a couple drinks and just relax a bit before you catch your train back to town. any trip to Peru really should include a visit to Machu Picchu, and the train tickets and the tickets to the site itself are difficult to get, so those are the ones you want to get well in advance. And then for me, I'd be structuring my whole trip around those dates, around the dates that I want to be at Machu Picchu. In general, as cliche as it sounds, it really is one of my favorite places in Peru. It's just such a beautiful and picturesque environment, and I think the world really has a gift in Machu Picchu. It's that rarest of discoveries, like King Tut's tomb. It's something that comes to us from ancient times that has somehow escaped the destruction of subsequent civilizations. So let's continue to respect and preserve this amazing place so that we might also be able to continue to study it and then hopefully uncover its secret past. Thanks for watching. Well, hey all, that's it. That wraps up my Machu Picchu series. And yes, this is one of those series that I have actually managed to complete. Please do let me know what you think about Machu Picchu, or if you have any questions about the site down there in the comments section. I'm going to start doing fairly regular Q&A videos where I'll go and select questions from YouTube comments, from Patreon messages, and from emails, and take some time to answer all of those. Also, as usual, I really want to express my thanks to everybody that supports Uncharted X and supports the channel via the value for value model. You guys are what makes this possible. If you like what I'm doing, or you're interested in supporting the channel, there's lots of ways to do that. It's all outlined at unchartedx.com/support. I hope that everyone is finding a way to navigate safely through these strange times that we're all living in, and that you're all doing well. I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing here. I've got a few things planned for the coming weeks. So until then, I'll see you all in the next video. Cheers.